All right, hello. So today we're going to talk about international migration, and we're going to touch on the social, political, economic, and moral dimensions of international migration. So, um, or we might call this a talk on the age of human mobility. So, as scholars and students of globalization, we live in an age of unprecedented human mobility. People move across national borders in numbers that would have been unimaginable to earlier generations. Run slide two, by the way. According to the UN Department of Economic and Social Affairs, the global number of international migrants reached 304 million people in 2024. It's a figure that's nearly doubled since 1990, when approximately 154 million people lived outside their country of birth. Move to slide three. And yet, as Khalid Koser has observed in his book, which you'll be reading this week, or an excerpt from it, called International Migration, A Very Short Introduction, this phenomenon of migration is consistently misunderstood. Migration happens to be one of those topics that generates intense political passion and media coverage, while it's at the same time among the least accurately perceived issue by the general public. Migrants are all at once romanticized and vilified. They're credited with building nations and blamed for destroying them. Now, what I want to do here is neither to celebrate nor to condemn migration, but understand it with the kind of seriousness it deserves. I want to examine what drives it, what forms it takes, the kinds of effects it produces, and what moral and political frameworks we might use to think about it more accurately and we might say justly. Now, migration is not a new phenomenon. We probably know that. It's been going on throughout the whole of history. Human beings have always been on the move, on the go. The entire history of civilization is one of people crossing steppes and seas, of empires recruiting labor over vast distances, of famine and war displacing millions, and so forth. Um, but what's genuinely new in the contemporary moment is the scale, speed, and political visibility of all this movement. The 304 million international migrants alive today constitute 3.7% of the world's population. A figure that, while it's significant, it means that the overwhelming majority of human beings still live in their country of birth. Even at its current record level, migration is not the norm. But it is increasingly the crucible in which some of the most fundamental questions about justice, about belonging, about national sovereignty, and the meaning of community are being explored and thrashed out. So let's move now to the next slide, slide four. We want to ask the question, who is a migrant? Before we can analyze migration, we need to be clear about what we're analyzing exactly. The term migrant is used loosely in public discourse to describe a whole range of people who are in reality governed by the very different legal frameworks that encompass them, and who have very different experiences as to what migration is. Take the example of somebody from the UK who comes over, say, to teach at an American university and decides to stay and gets their green card and eventually becomes a dual citizen naturalized, versus, say, a displaced migrant from gang warfare or from severe economic deprivation in Central America, who gets on the beast train, as it's called in Mexico, puts their life at risk every day, has to pay a cartel to be stuck across the border and so forth. It's quite a difference in experience. Um, so what Kozer is particularly useful here because he insists on definitional precision as a kind of precondition before we can do what we might call, you know, serious and you know, academic analysis. Now, the United Nations itself defines an international migrant as any person who changes their country of usual residence, distinguishing between short-term migrants, or those who relocate for 3 months but less than 1 year, and long-term migrants, which are those who relocate for a year or more. Now, this definition is broader than most people assume, and it's broader than how the term is typically used in much of our political and international discussions. By this particular measure that the UN gives us, the international student spending a year abroad, the professional relocated by a multinational corporation, or the refugee fleeing civil war are all technically international migrants. Okay? As I said, the experiences are different. The key distinction that matters for both policy and ethics are those between voluntary and forced migration. Now think about that, between voluntary and forced migration, and between regular or documented and irregular or undocumented migration. These distinctions are not always as clean as they appear, but they do inform the conversation in very important ways. All right, so let's talk about voluntary migration now. Voluntary migrants are those who move by choice, even if that choice is constrained by economic or social circumstances. The largest category of voluntary international migrants is labor migrants. That is, people who move in search of employment, are looking for higher wages or better professional opportunities, or just, just a decent form of life. Economic migration has driven the largest population flows of the modern era, from the great migrations of the 20th century, and I include the 19th century in that, um, and that's in the contemporary context we're looking at, to those who are currently moved from South and Southeast Asia to the Gulf states to work, from sub-Saharan Africa to Europe, and from Latin America to the United States. A second major category of voluntary migration is family reunification. That's, as we well know, the movement of family members to join a spouse, a parent or a child, or even a sibling who has established residence in a foreign country. In many destination countries, foreign reunification is the single largest pathway for immigration. A third category includes student migration, which has grown dramatically with the globalization of higher education, and retirement migration, in which older citizens of wealthy nations relocate to countries with lower costs of living or with warmer climates. And of course, if you look on the internet, there's always an ad, some kind of push ad that says if you're a retiree, you can live a lot cheaper in Costa Rica or Portugal or either somewhere in Africa. It seems to be with tensions that are taking place in the systems of developed countries who have generous benefits for retirees, but because of financial problems in these countries, those benefits are loosening or becoming less available. Then people are looking for other options and they're retiring to cheap countries. Mexico has always been a magnet for retirees, American retirees, for many generations. And there was actually an article that I read this morning. It was actually noticed in the U.S. State Department warning people about that because of the high level of cartel violence. I guess Americans aren't anywhere near as safe as they were even a few years ago. So So, all right, so now you can go to slide 5. So let's talk about forced migration. It's a different kind of migration. Forced migrants are those who move out of necessity, typically from the threat of violence, persecution, or other catastrophic conditions. The legal category of refugee is defined by the 1951 Refugee Convention, which defines the refugee as a person who has fled their country of origin owing to a well-founded fear of persecution based on race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, or political opinion. Now, a lot of the population, for example, of Israel in the last 20 years particularly has been because of that. A lot of people think that modern Israelis all came from Europe. Initially, most of them did, but the vast majority in the last 2 or 3 decades have been from parts of the world, starting with Russia, but increasingly from the Middle East, particularly Islamist countries that have been persecuting Jews. So they perform what's called aliyah, or migration to Israel. Um, Now, the United Nations, I can't remember the number, the UNHCR, United Nations Human Resettlement, I can't remember UNHCR, but it's their 2024 Global Trends Report, presents a landscape of forced displacement that is deeply alarming. By the end of 2024, according to this report, 123.2 million people worldwide were forcibly displaced as a result of persecution, conflict, violence, and significantly human rights violation, which was an increase of 7 million from the previous year. Now, that's a large number, and nearly double the figure from a decade ago. Of these, 36.9 million were recognized as refugees under international law. 73.5 million were internally displaced persons who had fled within their own country, and 8.4 million were asylum seekers whose claims were pending some kind of adjudication. Now, the scale of these numbers requires a moment of reflection, if not pause. 1 in every 67 people on Earth, this tells us, is currently and forcibly displaced. The largest displacement crisis in the world as of 2024, is Sudan, where 14.3 million people have been uprooted. You know, something we don't read about. We read all about what's happening in Israel and Palestine. We now we're reading a little bit of what's happening in the Persian Gulf, but we hardly ever hear about Sudan. It's like become invisible. But in Sudan, nearly 1 in 3 of the country's entire population has been displaced as a result of the devastating civil war that first erupted in 2023. The Democratic Republic of the Congo, Ukraine, and Myanmar and Syria round out the list of countries generating the largest displacement figures. These are not abstractions. They represent tens of millions of individual human lives that are interrupted, shattered, and rebuilt in conditions of what we would call extreme precarity. Now, it's important to note that forced migration includes not only refugees and asylum seekers, but also those displaced by environmental disasters and climate change, which is increasing. Environmental disasters are multiplying because of climate change. There's a feedback loop here. While the 1951 Convention on natural disasters does not recognize climate displacement as a basis for refugee status, the International Organization of Migration, I've actually been to Vienna and taken students there in the past, and for special presentation by the IOM, which is part of the United Nations. It's quite they do all the research on international migration. A lot of these statistics come from their studies. But the IOM's World Migration Report in 2024 notes that disaster-related displacement already accounts for a substantial and growing share of global displacement, and that climate change is expected to drive hundreds of millions of additional displacements in the coming decades. All right, so now let's look at what we've called regular and irregular migration. Another crucial distinction we need to make is between regular, that is documented, authorized, and irregular, undocumented, unauthorized migration, the terms we prefer to use rather than legal or illegal, which can misrepresent what's really going on and can also stigmatize the people. Regular migrants have obtained the necessary legal permissions, visas, work permits, residence permits from both their origin and destination countries. Irregular migrants are those who cross borders without authorization, who overstay their visas, or otherwise they fall outside this formal legal framework. The IOM, International Organization of Migration, estimates that irregular migrants constitute a significant minority of the total international migrant population. Though precise numbers are by definition, we call them irregular, they're difficult to acquire. Now, Koser, who talks about this, is careful to point out the line between regular and irregular migration is often permeable and contingent. Many migrants begin as regular migrants and become irregular through circumstances outside their control. You say, for example, an expired visa, or a failed asylum claim, or an employer who terminates a sponsored work agreement. Others enter into whatever country they're entering irregularly, but later regularize their status. So it works both ways. The moral and political significance we attach to these categories deserves scrutiny, as I said. That's a point we'll return to later in the discussion of the ethics of migration. All right, so let's look to the next slide, which is slide 6. Look at theories of migration, or why people move. Perhaps the most basic question in migration studies is, why do people move in the first place? The answer is more complex than it might initially appear. And the history of migration theory is really a history of progressively greater sophistication in attempts to address this kind of complexity. Start with what's sometimes called push-pull theory. The oldest and most intuitive framework is what I've described as push-pull theory. It was first systematized by the sociologist Everett Lee in 1966. This theory holds that migration is driven by a combination of factors that make a person's country of origin an unattractive or unsafe place to remain. These are the push factors. And as well as factors that make a potential destination country more attractive. These are the pull factors. Push factors include unemployment, low wages, poverty, political instability, persecution, violence, and environmental degradation. Pull factors include higher wages and employment opportunities, political stability and personal freedom, quality of educational and health institutions, or family connections and cultural affinities. By the way, these are the same reasons that people migrate within the United States from one part of the country to another. Of course, one thing that we're talking about international migration, but if you read the news media carefully, you'll see that internal migration, particularly from the north to the Sun Belt, or from the west coast to the central part of the country, is now an accelerating phenomenon because of changing economic conditions, both negatively in the push parts of the country and positively in the pull part of the country. I happen to be talking to you right now from a pull part of the country, actually part of the country that is one of the largest, fastest growing part of the country, the North Texas, Southern Oklahoma area. Now, push-pull theory has a virtue of simplicity, and it also has what we might call an explanatory intuitive power. It correctly identifies the basic motivational structure of mass migration decisions. but it's also attracted significant criticism. The most fundamental weakness of it is that it treats migration as an individual rational calculation, what's sometimes called rational choice theory, as though each potential migrant is a perfectly informed actor weighing costs and benefits in isolation before they decide to move. In reality, decisions about migration are deeply embedded in social networks and cultural norms and in historical patterns and what we might characterize as structural inequalities that the pull push or the push pull model cannot capture. As a sociologist by the name of Hein de Haas has argued, push pull theory cannot explain why, for example, migration flows often increase between countries even when relative economic conditions between them have not changed, or why the poorest people who face the greatest push pressures are often the least likely to migrate internationally because they lack the resources to do so. And I would add that this particular anomaly also applies to internal migration. So let's look at another theory about migration. It's sometimes called the world system approaches. World structural or world systems approaches to migrations were developed from the writings of a guy by the name of Emanuel Wallerstein and others who followed him. And these locate the causes of migration not in individual decision making, but in the unequal structure of the global capitalist economy. From this perspective, migration flows from the global south to the global north are not incidental, but inexorable. That is necessary and systemic. They're the predictable result of a world economy organized around the extraction of labor and resources from peripheral economies for the benefit of the core or the dominant economy. The movement of people follows the movement of capital, but in the opposite direction. Capital flows from the rich countries to the poor ones in search of cheap labor and raw materials, and people flow from the poor countries to rich ones in search of wages and opportunity. Now, this framework has the advantage of situating contemporary migration within a broader historical context, including the history of colonialism, which created many of these conditions in the first place, such as economic dependency, or political instability, or the underdevelopment of infrastructure. Now, these factors now drive migration from former colonies to former imperial powers. We had a lecture at the University of Denver back in 2006 with a prominent African American scholar who's now dead. His name was Charles Long. And he basically said that we're now in a period of reverse colonization where the people we colonized are now coming back and recolonizing us, not in a negative sense, but in terms of in a sense being necessary to us. You could look at something like the fact that the American population is shrinking, not only because of Trump has stopped off migration, but also of the declining birth rate. People think that's an individual choice, but it has huge demographic consequences, as we've seen. Not in the short term, in the long term. The effects usually aren't felt by people who make the decisions till much later in life, just like we're feeling the effects of the baby boom generation right now, not necessarily in a good way in terms of the younger generation. But this theory, this world systems theory helps explain why the major migration corridors in the contemporary world, like Mexico to the United States or North Africa to Europe or South Asia to the Gulf, tend to follow lines of historical connection established by colonialism and subsequent economic integration. So now we'll move to what they call the network theory and the idea of social capital. So the third major theoretical approach emphasizes the role of social networks in sustaining and shaping migration flows. Once the migration flow between two common countries begins, for whatever initial reason, It tends to perpetuate itself through networks of connections that migrants establish between their origin and their destination community. Migrants always settled in a destination country. Um, I'm sorry, migrants that are already settled in a destination country. They provide information or housing. They can give new migrants employment leads and emotional support from their home communities, which dramatically lowers the costs and risks of migration. Now, these networks create what sociologists call migration chains. Maybe you've heard that in some of the news accounts or discussions in the news about migration. Migration chain, or what is sometimes called cumulative causation. These are processes by which migration becomes self-reinforcing over time. Uh, and it tends to build upon itself. And these factors are independent of the original condition that initiated the migration in the first place. Now, network theory helps explain why migration flows tend to cluster geographically and ethnically. Why certain villages, for example, in Oaxaca, Mexico, have strong ties to certain neighborhoods in Los Angeles. Why Bangladeshi migrants concentrate in particular boroughs of London. Why Hmong refugees settle primarily in certain cities in Minnesota and California. By the way, when I was on sabbatical years ago in Santa Barbara, California, my son, who's now a middle-aged adult, was in kindergarten, and the kindergarten he went to in Santa Barbara, California at the time was like 70% Hmong. The Hmong, by the way, come from uh, the hill country of Laos and Cambodia. But network theory explains why migration tends to continue even when destination country governments attempt to reduce it through restrictive policies. The networks, I should say, that sustain migration are resilient and adaptive, and their benefits to individual migrants frequently outweigh the deterrent effects of the policy changes that a government may. All right, so we go to slide 7, and we want to look at the economic dimension of migration. So economic questions really lie at the heart of contemporary migration debates. So what are the economic effects of migration on destination countries, on origin countries, or on the migrants themselves? Now the answers are considerably and far more nuanced than either those who tout migration as an economic boom or those who are fear it or anxious about it as an economic threat. We tend to overplay both the threat and the advantages of migration. Now let's look at the effects on destination countries. The economic debate about migration in destination countries has been dominated by the question of labor market effects. The question always seems to be, does immigration lower the wage of native workers or take jobs from them? Now, the empirical literature, that is the data and all the different studies, is extensive and it's not completely consistent. And a lot of it is highly contested. But its broad findings are relatively clear. And that is what it shows that the effects of migration on native wages are on average small and often, I say often, not always, positive, particularly for native workers with different skills from those of immigrants. Immigrants and native workers tend to complement rather than substitute for each other in many labor markets. Immigrants often fill roles that native workers are unwilling to take at prevailing wages. Wages both at the low end of the skill spectrum, for example, in agriculture and construction or human care work like daycare, and these immigrants also fill roles at the high end, such as engineering, medicine, and computer technology. Fiscally speaking, that is, in terms of financial policies of government, the question of whether immigrants contribute more in taxes than they consume in public service, um, the evidence generally favors the view that immigrants make a net positive fiscal contribution over their lifetime. Not initially, but over their lifetime, particularly when their children's contributions are taken into account. So, first generation immigrants, which usually have low skills and occupy lower level jobs, may receive more in services than they pay in taxes. But the second generation tends to be a strong net fiscal positive because the second generation has a very high incentive to achieve and to make a contribution to the country from which their parents came. The National Academy of Sciences did a comprehensive review in 2016 of the evidence for the United States, and they concluded that immigration has an overall positive impact on long-term economic growth, innovation, and physical health. So at the macroeconomic level, immigration contributes to innovation. It contributes to entrepreneurship and also to demographic vitality in ways that are difficult to encompass in simple wage calculation. Immigrants and their children have founded a disproportionate share of the most successful technology companies in the United States and many other countries. Think of Google, for example, which was founded by immigrants. Demographic aging in wealthy destination countries, which has been a significant challenge for pension systems and healthcare financing, is substantially mitigated through the immigration of younger workers. Now, the economic effects of migration on origin countries are complex and potentially contradictory. On the one hand, we have what are called remittances, the money that migrants send back to their families in the home country. Remittances have become one of the most significant forms of international financial transfers. And I should say also a context in which a lot of dirty money is also transmitted, but we're not going to talk about it. That's not because of the immigrants, that's because of the way it's leveraged by the system. According to IOM's World Migration Report in 2024, international remittances surged by 650% between 2000 and 2022. They rose from 128 billion US dollars to 830 billion US dollars. And from that total, 647 billion in dollars was sent by migrants to low and middle income countries. Now, this figure actually dwarfs official development assistance, and in many countries exceeds foreign direct investment as a source of external finance. Remittances fund education, healthcare, housing construction, and small business development throughout the developing world. And they tend to be more stable and counter-cyclical than other kinds of capital flows. Migrants often send more money home when their origin countries are in crisis, and this rectifies the balance between the haves and the have-nots and prevents bailouts. So, I mean, the financial benefits of migration are very solid. On the other hand, migration of highly skilled workers, such as doctors, engineers, scientists, or teachers from developing to developed countries raises serious concerns about the quality of the system in the countries they left. This has historically been known as the brain drain, because we therefore have the loss of human capital that the poor countries cannot easily afford. When a country invests scarce resources in training a doctor who then emigrates to practice in a wealthy country, The origin country bears the cost without in any way claiming the benefit. The World Health Organization estimates that health worker migration from sub-Saharan Africa has significantly exacerbated healthcare shortages in the same region. Some researchers argue the possibility of emigration actually increases the educational investment in origin countries because the prospect of earning higher wages abroad raises the return to education even for those who ultimately do emigrate, which is a phenomenon sometimes called the brain gain effect. All right, so if you'll go to slide 8 now. So let's talk about the question of integration and social cohesion because of migration. Now, the social dimension of immigration are as contested as the economic ones, and perhaps even more politically charged. The central question is one of integration. How successfully do immigrants and their descendants become participants in the social, cultural, and civic life of destination countries? And what is the relationship between immigration and social cohesion? Now, the answer depends heavily on context. That is, on the scale and pace of migration, on the skills and educational level of the migrants, and the policies and institutions of the destination country. The presence of established diaspora communities. You know what a diaspora community is? Means diaspora is the Greek word for dispersion. So foreigners who have gone to other countries but have created community in those countries. Those are known as a diaspora. The degree of cultural and linguistic sorry, the degree of cultural and linguistic distance between migrants and the receiving society can affect in a very profound way the impact of migration. Destination countries have pursued very different integration models. There's the assimilationist model, which is what was standard in the US until relatively recently. And this expects immigrants to adopt the cultural norms and language of destination society. That is, the American context was so-called melting pot. Everybody became American, everybody thought like an American and learned English. Then there's the multiculturalist model, which is more prevalent today. I don't say it's not necessarily dominant, because when you implement it to the full extent, it can cause real issues in terms of the political stability of the country. But this recognizes and values the maintenance of distinct cultural identities within a common civic framework and various intermediate approaches. So you could say that Quebec in France, which has tried to succeed not France, I'm sorry, in Canada, Quebec in Canada, has tried to succeed from Canada a number of times in late 20th century, and it caused a lot of issues. The same idea, the arrangement was supposedly set up by the British after the Irish Civil War and independence movement in the early 20th century, but we all know what happened in Northern Ireland. So, but increasingly, a lot of countries today are using what might be called intermediate approaches, somewhere that's sort of in the gray area between assimilation and multicultural. Now, social science research on the relationship between immigration and social cohesion, which is what we're really talking about here, has generated a lot of debate. Political scientist Robert Putnam published influential research in 2007 suggesting that increasing ethnical diversity in American communities was associated in the short run with lower social trust and reduced civic engagement, not only between ethnic groups, but even within them. This finding has been widely discussed and contested. Critics have argued that Putnam's results reflect the effects of economic inequality rather than diversity per se, and that the long-range effects of diversity and social capital are more positive than the short-run picture suggests. Nonetheless, the question of how to maintain civic solidarity is increasingly diverse societies remains one of the central political challenges of our time. And there's a lot of studies that show that it is really impacting politics today in America in a very, very challenging way. The political dimensions of migration are therefore inescapable from the rise of nationalist and populist political movements across the world, which we read about all the time. In the US, in Europe, Australia, and elsewhere, immigration has become one of the most polarizing issues in democratic politics. And anti-immigrant sentiment has become a central driver of the populist wave that has reshaped the political landscape, particularly in the Western world over the past decade. Now, understanding this political dynamic requires attention to both material and its symbolic aspects. At the material level, we might say that debates about immigration are partly debates about labor market competition, but they're also about fiscal costs and the distribution of public services. Particularly, it becomes harder and harder to fund public services. With a tax base, which is always people always want to pay less taxes, they want more and more services. That's been shown by a lot of sociological studies. But the intensity of political reaction to immigration, particularly in communities that have had little direct exposure to immigrants in the past, suggests that what's at stake is not only material, but the question, but cultural and political questions. The question, especially of identity, of recognition, and the meaning of what it means to be in a community in the first place. As well-known political theorists such as David Miller and Michael Walzer, who actually was one of my teachers when I was in graduate school, they've argued democratic communities have legitimate interest in shaping their own character and completion. And immigration policy is one of the ways in which community exercise that self-determination. However, by the same token, the political discourse around social immigration is frequently distorted by misinformation and also by subtle forms of racism and racialized anxiety. Immigrants are consistently blamed for crime rates, welfare dependence, cultural decline, and economic stagnation, even in the face of extensive evidence that those attributions are empirically false or widely exaggerated. The IOM's World Migration Report from 2024 devotes an entire chapter to unpacking myths about migration and examining the actual issues on crime, security, and fiscal costs. This gap between political perception and empirical reality is in itself an important object of analysis. And I would say it's not just the perception. Perception very often is shaped by the news media and what public figures say in the news media and who it resonates with certain audience. But this debate tells us something about the ways in which American anxieties about social change, about racial hierarchy and national identity are projected on to the figure of the immigrant. All right, so let's go to slide 9. So one of the most striking features of contemporary international migration is the inadequacy of the institutional frameworks to establish the government. Unlike international trade or finance, which are governed by dense networks of multinational institutions and binding legal agreements, international migration is governed primarily by bilateral agreements between individual states, supplemented by a relatively weak framework of the 1951 convention, which I mentioned, which turned out to be really a patchwork of regional arrangements. The 1951 Refugee Convention, which was negotiated in the aftermath of World War II, established the foundational legal principle of was called non-refoulement, the prohibition of returning a refugee to a country where they would face persecution. Now, this principle has been widely ratified, has significantly shaped international state practice, but it applies only to recognized refugees, not to the much larger category of migrants fleeing poverty or environmental degradation or generalized violence in a country, like with gang warfare. The gap between legal protection available to refugees and the broader universe of people moving under conditions of acute vulnerability is one of the central fault lines of contemporary migration government. In 2018, the United Nations adopted what's called the Global Impact for Safe, Orderly, and Regular Migration, sometimes known as the GCM, which was the first intergovernmental agreement to address international migration in a comprehensive manner. The GCM is non-binding, but it represents an important statement of international principle, including the principle that migration should be safe and orderly, that migrants should have access to basic rights and services, and that the root cause of forced migration needs to be addressed through development cooperation and conflict prevention. Now, the compact was adopted by 152 states, but several countries, including the United States, under the Trump administration, and a number of European states refused to sign, reflecting the deep political divisions that migration governance generates. The broader chapter of global migration governance reflects a structural tension at the heart of the international system. And what is that tension? It's the tension between sovereignty of states to control their borders and the interests and rights of peoples who need to choose to cross those borders. The international system is built around the principle of state sovereignty ever since 1648, the so-called Treaty of Westphalia. And migration sits at the intersection of sovereignty and human rights in a way that existing institutions are not very well equipped to navigate. Okay, so now let's go to slide 10. All right. So we're going to talk about the moral dimensions of migration. And this really gets into our course on social justice because we're looking at the questions of justice, rights, and law. So beyond the empirical question about what migration is and what does it lie and what it does and what migration is and what it does, there lies a set of profound moral and philosophical questions about what states are actually entitled to do about migration and what obligations we owe to migrants and refugees. These questions do not have easy answers, and this lecture, I'm not going to pretend, will pretend otherwise. But there are questions about any serious engagement in migration as a social justice issue that we need to confront. So let's go to slide 11. The most radical challenge to existing migration restrictions comes from a kind of political philosophy we call cosmopolitanism. Cosmopolitanism begins from the premise that all human beings have equal moral worth, regardless of their national status or citizenship. From this premise, a guy by the name of Joseph Cairns, Carens, who was one of the most influential philosophers of migration, argued in a landmark 1987 essay, which was entitled Aliens and Citizens. He argued that existing restrictions on migration are morally indefensible. As Cairns wrote, the citizenship of a wealthy country is, from a global perspective, analogous to a feudal birthright privilege. It confers enormous advantages on those who possess it through no merit of their own, simply by virtue of the accident of birth. Same kind of question now haunts the questions about birthright citizenship. The cosmopolitan argument for open borders holds that if we're committed to equal moral consideration for all people, we cannot consistently defend a system in which the country in which a person happens to be born determines their access to education or health care or physical security or economic insecurity or even political participation. Now, I want to read you from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy here because it summarizes the core cosmopolitan insight and the insight into right in the following way. Quote, the cosmopolitan egalitarian case for open borders combines the core moral insight that all human beings, whether they are compatriots or foreigners, are equally deserving of moral consideration with their central empirical observation that one's country of birth often has a profound impact on one's life's prospect. Now, Karen's position, who I just mentioned, has been extensively developed and debated in the 40 years since his original essay appeared. But in a 2013 book, which he wrote, which is entitled "The Ethics of Immigration," he distinguishes between ideal theory, that is, what justice would require in a world organized around cosmopolitan principles, and what he calls non-ideal theory, or what policies are justifiable given the world as it actually is. Cairns maintains that in an ideal theory, open borders are required, while he acknowledges that in a non-ideal world, we actually inhabit some restrictions may be necessary under particular conditions. Now, the cosmopolitan case for open borders has been connected by political philosophers. I should say, it's been contested by political philosophers. Certain political philosophers who defend states' rights to control immigration. The most influential of these comes from communitarians and philosophers that call them statists, like Walzer and Miller. In his influential work, Spheres of Justice, which came out in 1983, Walzer argued that political communities are entitled to control their own membership because the character of a community, its culture, its institution, its way of life, is constituted partly by who belongs to it. According to Walzer, admission decisions are among the most fundamental acts of collective determination that a political community can exercise, just like they are for who gets admitted to a college or university. I always wonder if we say, well, we shouldn't, we should be selective in a university because we just say anybody who wants to get a university degree should apply. Those are called open enrollment approaches. And we all say, well, yeah, no, that's not right. But we say, yeah, anybody should live in the United States. Isn't that a contradiction in terms? I'm not saying that's my view, but it's a question we need to ponder. So Miller has developed a different but related argument grounded in the value of national identity. Miller argues that national communities that are defined by shared history, culture, and civic institutions generate special obligations among their members that cannot be overridden by claims of outsiders. States are the institutional expression of national community, and they are entitled to give priority to the interests of their members in designing immigration policy. That doesn't mean that states have no obligations to non-members, and Miller acknowledges obligations that we all have for humanitarian assistance, particularly to refugees. But it does mean that states are not required to treat the economic interests of potential migrants from other countries as equivalent to the interests of their own citizens. Now, a guy by the name of Christopher Wellman, W-E-L-L-M-A-N, has offered a third variant of this statist position, which he said is grounded in the value of freedom of association. Wellman argues that just as individuals have the right to choose their intimate associates and to exclude others from their private relationships, democratic political communities have the right to determine their own membership. The right of self-determination includes the right to restrict immigrants, even when such restrictions cause hardship to excluded migrants. Okay? So even those who defend broad state discretion over economic immigration typically acknowledge stronger obligations toward refugees. Those who are fleeing persecution, violence, or other acute threats to their basic security. The principle of non-refoulement reflects a moral baseline of this sort, because it says whatever latitude states have in regulating economic migration, they are not entitled to return people to situations where they face a serious death of risk or persecution. But the moral case for robust protection of refugees extends beyond the non-refoulement principle. If we accept that all persons have a right to basic physical security, that is, a right to be killed, tortured, or persecuted, then we must also accept that states have a positive obligation to provide asylum to those whose home states have refused to protect their rights. The philosopher Martin Gibney has argued that the contemporary refugee regime is morally deficient precisely because it places the entire burden of refugee protection on a small number of states. primarily developing countries in the global south, rather than distributing that burden equitably across all states with the capacity to provide protection. So the situation of the 36.9 million recognized refugees globally, the vast majority of whom are hosted by low and middle income countries with far fewer resources than wealthy states that generate the most intense political debate about refugees. This is a stark illustration of this injustice when it comes to distributing help to migrants. Turkey alone hosts approximately 3.2 million Syrian refugees. Uganda and Pakistan each host over a million. Germany, which is one of the wealthiest countries in the world, took in about 1.8 million Ukrainian refugees in 2022, which was a response widely praised, but only after decades of more restrictive policies toward refugees from the Middle East, Africa, and South Asia. The fact that Germany treated Ukrainians different than non-European refugees raised profound questions about racial and cultural bias in the application of universal humanitarian principles. So a final moral dimension deserving attention here is the situation of people who cross borders without legal authorization, or who remain in a country after their legal permission to do so has expired. Now, in contemporary political discourse, irregular migrants are frequently described in terms that emphasize that law breaking they're described in terms that emphasize their law breaking, and that justifies their exclusion and deportation. You see a lot of that in the current Trump administration. But the moral situation is more complex than the framing suggests. Now consider the situation of a person from a country ravaged by poverty, or by violence, or climate disruption. And they enter a wealthy country that is irregularly because there's no legal pathway for migration available to them. This person, of course, we said, has broken a law. But the law they've broken is a law that serves the interests of the wealthy country's citizens by excluding the competition of their labor and the potential claims on their public resources. The question of whether obedience to such a law is a clear moral imperative is not settled by the fact of its illegality. Many moral philosophers argue that there is no inherent moral wrong in crossing a border without authorization, when the border itself is a product of morally arbitrary and historically contingent system of state sovereignty. But then you have to ask the question, if there is no border, a borderless world, what are the ethical implications of that? So there's no clear answers. We live in a world that is all interconnected. This is what the word globalization means. And we talk about terms like global citizen, where you have somebody like a guy named, can't remember his name, Kwame Appiah, I'm sorry. He's an African philosopher. And he says that, everybody has looked at every human citizen as being equal in value. He's therefore not too big on immigration restriction. But you have to ask the question, okay, so everybody can be wherever they want to be, and everybody can live wherever they want to be. Does that create chaos? Well, usually in implementation it does. So and we tend to look at it as a black and white picture. And in fact, the immigration scene we see now is raising more and more issues that need to be solved. And so if social justice was an easy answer, yeah, it's like, deport them all or let them all in. If it was as simple as that, we wouldn't be taking a course, would we? And so this requires some very refined thinking, looking at it case by case, but how all the different cases add up to create the big picture. So let's conclude now. So let's look at the whole question of migration and what we call the claims of justice. So I've covered a lot of ground here just in the past hour or so, but the underlying thread is consistent. Migration is not simply a policy problem being managed by technical adjustment. It is a phenomenon that cuts to the heart of some of the deepest questions about justice, solidarity, human dignity, and the moral significance of political boundaries. In other words, questions of social justice. The 304 million people who live outside their country of birth in 2024, these people are not just abstraction. They're workers and parents, refugees and students. They're entrepreneurs and care providers. They're people who have exercised the most fundamental of human capacities, the capacity to move in search of safety, in search of dignity and a better life. The 123.2 million people who are forcibly displaced are not a policy challenge, simply to be managed or arbitrated by policy wonks in a think tank. They're human beings whose fundamental rights have been violated, often, no, actually through no fault of their own, and who have claims on the rest of humanity that we cannot simply dismiss by invoking state sovereignty as a kind of overriding principle. At the same time, political communities that receive migrants or that are asked to receive them are not simply empty containers waiting to be filled. They're not abstractions either. They're communities with histories, institutions, cultures, and legitimate interests in shaping their own future. The questions of how to balance the claims of migrants against the interests and prerogatives of political communities is really quite difficult. And there aren't any easy answers. What can we say with confidence is this: the current global system for governing migration is inadequate, it's unjust, and it's in need of fundamental reform. It's inadequate because it lacks the institutional capacity to manage flows of the scale and complexity that now characterize international migration. It's unjust because it distributes the burdens of migration in ways that are deeply inequitable. It places the heaviest responsibilities on the poorest countries and the most vulnerable communities. And it's in need of reform because the forces driving migration, inequality, conflict, climate change, and demographic shifts, these aren't going away. In fact, they're accelerating, or intensifying. Now, Koser ends his book, International Migration, with a call for what he calls managed migration grounded in mutual interest and international cooperation. This is a pragmatic and reasonable aspiration, but it's not sufficient unless it's also grounded in a commitment to the equal dignity of worth in all persons, wherever they're born and whatever legal status they currently hold. Social justice in a global context, I would say, requires that we really think about this problem, profoundly. And we're going to talk more about it as we go forward.